A company bans casual Friday clothes company-wide. Complaints spike immediately, even from employees who almost never wore casual clothes in the first place. Nobody threatened to quit over a t-shirt. Nobody had a strong feeling about denim on a Thursday. But the moment the choice disappeared, people who barely used it suddenly cared about it a great deal. That reaction has a name, and it was identified by a psychologist named Jack Brehm back in 1966. And it explains a strange amount of what goes wrong inside modern workplaces. Brehm called it psychological reactance. The core idea is simple to state and surprisingly hard to remember in the moment it actually matters. When people believe a freedom they had is being taken away, restricted, or threatened, they don't just quietly lose that option. They experience something closer to a motivational jolt, a surge of desire specifically for the thing being restricted, and often a push to reassert control over it, sometimes by doing the exact thing they were told not to do. The restriction itself becomes the trigger. Not the thing being restricted, the fact that someone else decided you couldn't have it. This is different from simple disagreement. You can tell someone you disagree with a decision without feeling any particular pull toward defying it. Reactance is hotter than that. It's the specific, almost physical urge to reclaim a choice the moment you sense it slipping away, even for things you weren't especially attached to a minute earlier. Brehm's original lab experiments demonstrated this with something as mundane as toy preference. Researchers had children rate how much they wanted various toys. Then they told the kids that one particular toy, one they'd rated only moderately, was now off limits. Ratings for that toy jumped, not because the toy changed, because access to it did. In follow-up studies with adults, the same pattern held with everything from music selections to consumer products. Tell people they can't have something, and in a meaningful number of cases, their desire for it climbs, sometimes past the level of things they'd actually preferred beforehand. The effect has picked up a second name in pop psychology, the forbidden fruit effect, a nod to the oldest story in the book about wanting something specifically because you were told not to touch it. Researchers later found supporting evidence for related patterns outside the lab too. A famous study by Driscoll, Davis, and Lipetz in 1972 looked at real couples and found that parental interference in a relationship was associated with intensified romantic feelings between the couple, a pattern researchers nicknamed the Romeo and Juliet effect, after the fictional lovers whose families' opposition supposedly deepened their attachment. Whether that particular real-world pattern replicates cleanly in every context is debated among researchers today, but the underlying mechanism, reactance to a threatened freedom, has held up across decades of controlled experiments in ways the folk version of the story hasn't needed to rely on. Brehm's theory actually spelled out a mechanism, not just an observed pattern. And the mechanism matters because it tells you when reactance gets worse, not just that it exists. Reactance, in his framework, scales with how important the threatened freedom felt to the person before it was threatened, how completely the restriction removes it, and how many other freedoms feel simultaneously at risk once one gets taken away. A minor freedom that mattered little produces mild reactance. A freedom someone genuinely valued, even if they rarely exercised it, produces sharp reactance the moment it's threatened, sometimes sharper than the reactance produced by losing something they used constantly, because value and usage frequency aren't the same thing. This is why the casual Friday example at the start actually tracks real research rather than just being a catchy hook. Plenty of employees who rarely wore anything but business casual on Fridays still valued having the option, and losing the option, not losing the outfit, was what produced the complaint. People also tend to generalize. A single restriction on one specific freedom often gets experienced as a signal that other freedoms might be next, which is part of why one unpopular mandate can trigger disproportionate anxiety about entirely unrelated policies that haven't even changed yet. There's a related concept worth distinguishing here, because people sometimes conflate the two. The Streisand effect describes what happens when an attempt to suppress or hide information backfires by drawing more attention to it. Named after a 2003 incident where a lawsuit meant to remove a photo from public view instead massively increased its circulation. That's a close cousin of reactance, but not identical to it. The Streisand effect is mostly about attention and visibility. Reactance is about desire and motivation to act, specifically the pull toward reclaiming a restricted choice rather than simply noticing it more. Both point the same general direction, though, and both explain why organizations that try to quietly kill something people liked without acknowledgement often generate more attachment to it than if they'd left it alone entirely. Here's the part that matters for anyone managing people. Reactance isn't rebellion for its own sake, and it isn't a character flaw in strong-willed employees. It's a predictable, measurable, psychological response that shows up in essentially everyone, and it shows up whether or not the restriction in question is reasonable. A completely sensible rule can still generate completely disproportionate resistance, purely because of how it removed a choice, rather than what the choice actually was. That distinction between resistance to substance and resistance to the loss of control itself is the whole ballgame for a manager trying to figure out why a policy that looked harmless on paper produced weeks of quiet sabotage in practice. Think about how many workplace policies are, structurally, exactly the setup Brehm tested in a lab, just dressed up in corporate language. A mandatory return to office policy is a textbook reactance trigger. Set aside for a second whether working from an office 5 days a week is objectively better or worse for any given role. The actual commute time, the actual productivity difference, the actual collaboration benefit, all of that is a separate conversation. What reactance theory predicts, independent of any of those substantive questions, is that a flat mandate announced with no flexibility and no rationale will generate resentment out of proportion to the policy's real cost. And that's exactly what companies rolling out rigid in-office mandates over the past few years have reported. Surveys following blanket return-to-office announcements consistently show complaint volume, quiet quitting, and voluntary attrition spiking well beyond what you'd expect from commute inconvenience alone. Employees who worked from home 2 days a week and barely used the flexibility suddenly treat losing that flexibility as an attack on their autonomy generally, not just a change to their Tuesday schedule specifically. The mandate didn't just remove 2 days of remote work, it removed the sense that they had any say in the arrangement at all, and that's the piece that actually drives the backlash. A second scenario worth walking through in detail happens around informal social spaces at work rather than formal policy at all. Picture a team that's built up an unofficial after-hours Slack channel, mostly memes and small talk, nothing sensitive, nothing against any actual rule. A new department head, worried it looks unprofessional or wastes time, shuts it down without much explanation, maybe folding it into a general channel with a note about keeping things focused. What tends to happen next isn't that people simply comply and refocus. A new unofficial channel appears somewhere else within days, sometimes on a personal messaging app entirely outside company visibility, which is a strictly worse outcome from the manager's own stated goal of keeping communication professional and visible. The underlying behavior the manager wanted to curb, informal chatter during work hours, usually continues at roughly the same rate. What's lost is visibility into it, and a measurable dip in how much people trust that new department head's judgment going forward. The channel itself was never really the point. Reclaiming the choice to have an informal space was. A second common trigger sits inside tool and software policies. A company bans a chat app, a browser extension, or a productivity tool that a chunk of the team had grown to like, usually for a reasonable-sounding security or standardization reason. Within days, workarounds appear. People install the tool anyway through personal devices, route work through unofficial channels, or simply become quietly less cooperative about adopting whatever official replacement IT rolled out instead. The workaround isn't really about the tool's specific features most of the time. It's a small, low-risk way of reclaiming a choice that got made for people instead of with them. IT departments that have tracked this pattern report that outright bans on shadow IT tools frequently produce more shadow IT, not less, because the ban itself becomes the thing people are responding to. A third scenario shows up around meeting and communication norms. Imagine a manager institutes a blanket no phones during meetings rule after one bad experience with someone visibly checking messages during a client call. Reasonable impulse. But rolled out as a flat, unexplained mandate applied to every meeting regardless of context, the rule tends to generate exactly the behavior it was meant to prevent, just relocated. People start checking phones under the table instead of on top of it, or they mentally check out of meetings they now experience as being run by decree rather than by shared understanding. The specific behavior the rule targeted usually persists. What changes is that it goes underground, and trust in the manager who imposed the rule erodes a little in the process. A fourth pattern, quieter but common, involves mandatory time off. It sounds backwards, but companies that have rolled out mandatory minimum vacation policies, forcing employees to take a certain number of days off whether they want to or not, sometimes see resistance from the exact employees the policy was designed to help. Someone who was happily grinding through a heavy project can experience being told they must take a week off as a loss of control over their own schedule and push back against the very thing that would objectively benefit them purely because it was framed as a requirement rather than an offered choice. Notice the thread running through all four of these. In every case, the actual substance of the policy is defensible, sometimes obviously so. What varies is how much choice the policy visibly preserved for the person on the receiving end and how much explanation accompanied the restriction. That's the lever. And it's the lever most managers never think to pull, because most managers assume resistance is about the rule's content. It usually isn't. It's about the framing. The most common mistake managers make here is treating pushback as proof the rule was wrong, or, alternatively, treating pushback as proof employees just need to be told more firmly. Both responses miss the actual mechanism. If a manager sees resistance and assumes the policy itself must be flawed, they end up either scrapping genuinely necessary rules or watering them down until they stop solving the original problem. If a manager instead doubles down, repeating the mandate louder and adding enforcement, they usually intensify the exact reactance driving the resistance in the first place, since nothing amplifies a threat to autonomy, like being told, again, that you have no say in the matter. Neither path addresses what's actually happening psychologically. The rule isn't usually the enemy. The complete absence of explanation, or remaining choice, is. Brehm's own later research, extended by other psychologists over the following decades, pointed toward a fairly specific fix, and it isn't complicated, even if it takes discipline to apply consistently. Two things reliably reduce reactance without requiring you to drop the underlying rule. The first is explanation. A restriction that comes with real reasoning, not corporate boilerplate but an actual honest account of why the rule exists, generates measurably less resistance than the same restriction delivered as a flat command. People don't need to agree with the reasoning to have their reactance lowered by hearing it. The act of being given a reason, treated as someone capable of understanding a rationale rather than just following an order, changes how the restriction lands, even when the outcome is identical. The second lever is preserved choice. Reactance responds specifically to the sense that a freedom has been eliminated entirely. A restriction that leaves some meaningful choice intact within it, even a small one, tends to generate far less pushback than one that closes off every option. A return-to-office policy that mandates 3 specific days, but lets each team pick which 3, or lets individuals swap days within limits, triggers noticeably less resistance than an identical total requirement handed down as a fixed, non-negotiable schedule with 0 input. The total amount of required office time can be exactly the same. What changes the psychological experience is whether the person on the receiving end still feels like an agent making a decision or an object having a decision made to them. This lines up with a broader body of research in self-determination theory, developed by psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan starting in the 1970s, which found that people's motivation and satisfaction at work depend heavily on feeling autonomous, not on being free of rules altogether. Deci and Ryan's studies distinguished between controlling language, instructions and rules delivered as commands with no acknowledgement of the other person's perspective, and autonomy-supportive language, which delivers the same substantive requirement but frames it with rationale and some acknowledgement of choice. Their experiments found that identical tasks, assigned identically in substance but differently in language, produced meaningfully different levels of intrinsic motivation and resentment. A manager doesn't need to remove a requirement to lower reactance to it. They need to stop delivering it like a command, with no room for the other person's perspective to exist inside it. Put those two together, and you get a genuinely practical diagnostic for any manager rolling out a new restriction. Before announcing it, Ask two questions. Have I actually explained the real reason? Not the sanitized version, but the real one. And is there any piece of this that people could still choose for themselves, even a small piece? If the honest answer to both is no, expect resistance disproportionate to the rule's actual content, and don't be surprised when that resistance shows up as complaints, workarounds, or quiet disengagement from people who, a month earlier, wouldn't have cared much about the thing you just restricted. There's a useful diagnostic question buried in all of this too, one worth asking anytime a new policy produces pushback that feels bigger than the policy itself. Is the team reacting to what the rule actually does? Or are they reacting to having had a choice taken away without warning or explanation? Those are two completely different problems requiring two completely different responses. And confusing one for the other is how a perfectly sensible workplace rule turns into a morale problem nobody saw coming. The rule was never really the issue. The way it took the choice away usually was, if you manage people, you're going to keep needing rules. And that's fine. Reactance theory was never an argument against having any restrictions at all. It's a warning about the gap between a rule that's technically correct and a rule that people can actually live with. Close that gap with a real reason and a scrap of remaining choice, and most of the resistance you were bracing for simply never shows up. Subscribe if you want the next one of these explained before you're the manager relearning it the hard way.